Everyone, I'm Ellie, and welcome to part 3 of my Hero Rey build log. This week we're going to be looking at Rey's tunic, which is really the main part of this costume and the biggest difference from her Jakku costume. So let's jump right in and get started. Whenever you work with a material that has a pattern on it, you want to make sure you're cutting it on the proper grain, so that way it looks right when everything's put together. I've marked the grain on my pattern pieces so I know which way the pattern is supposed to go on my finished costume. For this costume, I cut out 2 front pieces, a back piece, and then the 4 skirt pieces. For my main material, I'm using a blanket from Amazon. I'll leave the link in the description below. This is a great alternative to the screen accurate fabric, which is sold out from Mood and is also $20 a yard. This whole blanket was $20 and I have enough to make 2 complete tunics. Once I have the main pattern pieces done, I'll move on to the lining. The lining is a brown satin that I purchased from Walmart because it was very inexpensive and it was the right color. And I'm going to cut out all the same pieces for that as well. Now our first step for constructing the tunic is to put all of our skirt pieces together. That's what I've called this thing on the bottom of Rey's tunic. It's kind of like a skirt. So I am going to be sewing around the edges of all of my skirt pieces, connecting the fashion fabric to my lining fabric. I want to make sure that the raised part of my pattern and the shiny side of my satin are what are touching in the middle, so that way when I flip them out, those will be the outside parts. Once I have all the skirt pieces stitched, trimmed, and flipped inside out, I'm going to go ahead and iron them flat. Rey's tunic has a yoke at the upper back, so rather than being a seam line on her shoulders, there's actually one in her upper back where her shoulder blades are. So this has to be stitched together in the center back, and I want to make sure that my diamond pattern matches up as nicely as possible. No one will ever see this with my wig, but it's just something that I want to do so I can be proud of it. Matching up patterns, especially ones like diamonds, can be really complicated and kind of infuriating. So it takes a lot of time and patience to sit there and try to match them out. Sometimes what I do is I'll stick pins into the corners of the patterns that I want to match. Then I can match up those pins, stitch it, and see if it looks correct. I definitely suggest using a basting stitch first, so that way when you have to rip it out a few times, it is not the end of the world. But once we do have this all matched up, it looks amazing, and I'm really happy with the way it looks. Next, we'll go ahead and stitch on our back piece to the bottom of our yoke, and then after that, we can stitch up our side seams. I complete these steps for the outer layer, and now we're going to move on to the lining. The lining has one extra step. I decided that I want to add a facing around the collar of this tunic. A facing is usually made of your same fashion fabric, but rather than lining the entire garment, you'll only line the part that you think will be seen. As I'm moving around, I think you might sometimes see inside of the neckline, so I want to make sure that that looks continuous and doesn't just look like brown satin. So I have gone ahead and cut one more piece of my fashion fabric. This one is the same as my front tunic piece. However, rather than cutting the entire piece, I just cut the edges and about 3 inches extra. Once I have that cut and the back center seam stitched together, I'm going to go ahead and attach it to my lining material. My lining was cut with the whole entire pattern, so this way I can try to line everything up and make sure it looks right. Now, I'm sure there are better, more efficient, and proper ways to do this, but this is how I attach my facing to my lining material. First, I line up the facing onto the lining exactly how you would want it to look. So I'm going to put everything flush against the edges. Then, starting in the middle where our back center seam is, I'm going to pick up the material and flip it over. So this way it's no longer flush, it's actually the opposite. And that's where I'm going to run my stitch. However, you need to make sure that you scoot your material a little bit closer because as you stitch, you're going to be taking up material, right? And you don't want it to end up super short and far away from your edges. So I go ahead and pin this facing all the way along the edge of my lining material. As I'm pinning, you might notice that I'm consistently flipping over that facing to make sure that it's still lining up with my edges. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it at least has to go further than my lining material. So that way when I'm stitching it onto my tunic, you don't end up seeing splotches of brown satin or it doesn't reach all the way to the seam. So with that stitch into place, I make sure everything looks correct, and then I'll run a top stitch along that as well, just to hold it into place. Now I can stitch up the rest of my lining, adding the back piece and stitching up the sides. Now before we line our tunic, we do have to attach our skirt pieces. So I go ahead and lay out my fashion layer. I'm going to start with my front skirts, which I know I want to end at my side seams of my tunic. So I'll put one edge on the side seam and pin all the way across until we get to wherever it's gonna end on our crossover. I made a very long crossover, so I don't know if it'll take up the whole width or not, and that is perfectly fine. So once that's pinned into place, I can move on to the back pieces. Again, I know I want them to end at the side seam, so I put it on the side seam and then go all the way into the middle. Hopefully they'll just meet up according to my measurements and my mock-up, but you never know. It's okay if they do overlap a little bit. Once they're pinned into place, I run a basting stitch along them, and at this point I can try on my tunic and make sure that everything is still fitting where I want it to, and that the waist seam is in a good spot. Thankfully, everything fit perfectly, and I was able to run a final stitch over those skirt pieces. Now, with our skirt pieces all attached, we get to finally add our lining to the top of our tunic. So just like any other lining, we want our two right sides to be touching, and we'll stitch along the edges and flip it inside out. And now we go ahead and start pinning around the entire tunic. I'm starting at center back, since we have that seam there that I know is supposed to match up. Also, whenever I add a lining, before I do any pinning around the edges, I match up all the seams that should match. So for this one, I matched up center back, the seam along the back, as well as our side seams. So this way I know that at least everything is in kind of the right place and it's not going to shift around too much. So starting at center back, I begin pinning all the way around the edges of our tunic. The top edge is pretty easy to do, but when you get to the part where the skirts are, it gets a little bit tricky. We have to roll up our skirts or fold them up very nicely so they'll lay inside of our lining as we stitch along that bottom edge, since we want the skirts to be on the outside after we're done lining. If we just left them flat and outside while we were stitching, they would end up on the inside of the lining, and that would completely defeat the purpose. So we roll up those skirts very, very gently and pad them so they're as flat as possible, and we pull the lining over top of it, and then we'll pin along that bottom edge. When you fold up those skirts and then pull the lining over top, it's going to take a little bit more lining material than if the skirts were not there, since the skirts have all that extra mass and material inside. So you want to make sure that you follow your pattern and line up the edge of your lining material with the edge of your tunic material. Now I went ahead and stitched all around this, and I left about 3 or 4 inches open at the center back of my tunic. Once it's all been stitched, I go ahead and flip it inside out, and it's the moment of truth, and thankfully everything works. It looks exactly like it should. So we can go ahead and press this if you want. And now we're going to close up that hole at the top of the tunic using a very simple blind stitch. Then we can go ahead and do the arm size as well, which I'm also doing with a blind stitch. I fold both the lining and the tunic material over and pin all around the arm's eye, and then I go over with hand needle and thread to stitch it together. I tried to hide these stitches as best I can. Now to close off our tunic, I'm going to be using 2 sets of snaps, one on each overlap. So I start by attaching the snaps to my overlaps, and then I put one on the inside of the tunic on the left side and one on the outside of the tunic on the right side, where those two edges will meet so they can snap together and I don't have to worry about my tunic shifting. And with that, our tunic is done. This piece looks really clean and I love the look of the Amazon blanket. I think that it really does look just like the mood fabric. A lot of people have been dyeing this material, but I chose not to and I'm happy with that. I really like the colors and how it works with my pants and my shirt. Hopefully next time we'll be working on the obi and the tabards, and then all it'll be left will be little accessories like the wig, the wraps, the boots, etc. So I cannot wait to get started on those and to finish up this costume. It's been a long time coming and I love the way it looks. Every time we complete a new piece, I feel better and better about it. So I cannot wait to finish it off and become a Jedi. Well, a Jedi in training, I guess? Anyway, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in, and as always, keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I will see you all next time. Bye!